I have a body. My guest today has a body. Hopefully, you, listener, do in fact have a body. And the fun thing about, well, maybe not that fun, but one undeniable fact about having a body is a body will age as long as we've got one to care for. And if I'm not sharing too much for this spin up of an intro, my grandmother will be turning 86 tomorrow. I am undeniably grandma's girl. She's my special person. I talk about her when I do all my self care workshops. But I am observing very directly the undeniable fact of her aging. It's really come up on us in these last few years. And there seems to be this foundational difference in belief between some of the members of my family who think like, well, this is just how it is. It doesn't have it's not lifestyle. It's a roll of the dice. It just is. And clearly I disagree, or I wouldn't live the life I lived probably. And I think my guest today would also aggressively disagree. I hope. And Sally, I have to profess, I did not practice pronouncing your last name. So is it Duplantier or Duplantier?
You're close. I'm a Duplantier through marriage. It's a French name, so it's Duplantier. Yes.
Yes, Sally Duplantier. Welcome to Better Than Fine.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here, Darlene, and to talk about this topic because you're right. You and I both share a similar belief about aging.
It is fast, not to go off on my own personal tangent right at the top of the show, but it's fascinating to me to now have this very direct exposure into my extended family's belief system. Where, again, hopefully I'm not giving away too much of my grandmother's information, but she has Parkinson's. Mm-hmm. And of course, anyone who's very familiar with neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, we know that lifestyle affects symptoms deeply. And in the case of Parkinson's disease, the amount of antioxidants in your diet can really diminish your symptoms. And so I really had to kind of arm wrestle them a bit. I've just been making her a lot of smoothies, and then I have to rely on her other caregivers and me to give her these smoothies to try to get more antioxidants in to keep her tremors down. But they really are like, oh no, that's not going to do anything. This is stupid. I'm like, no, it's really important.
Okay, so you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to just jump in. I just
Please.
published a paper with Dr. Christopher Gardner at Stanford, and he's and it's actually on the topic of the link between diet and Alzheimer's, which is also another neurodegenerative disease. And in fact, Alzheimer's is the 7th leading cause of death in the world. But it is the only disease for which there is no cure, no therapy, nothing to actually reverse it once it starts. And what we studied, this research project I did at Stanford, was the link between diet and cognitive decline. And yes, diet makes a difference.
Peek behind the curtain when you shared with me that you had published said paper. This is why I had asked for the paper was because I wanted it for myself. But I also am excited to talk about it for our listeners because I think, the average age of a listener of Better Than Fine is 35. And I think when you're in your 30s, you start to feel that you're not in your 20s physically, but you're not necessarily considering that the choices that you're making at 35 and 45 are going to affect your cognitive health, your brain health in your 60s, 70s, 80s, God bless you, hopefully your 90s. Yeah. But how true is that? Like, how much does it matter now?
It is so true. So with this project that I did with Dr. Gardner and the paper we subsequently published, I think one of the key takeaways for me is that with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, the pathology starts in middle age. It starts decades before symptoms begin to show. And if we can even slow the onset of Alzheimer's or dementia by 5 years, we could cut the cost and the burden to families and to society by half, just delaying the onset by 5 years. So a lot of people will have pathology, but it never actually manifests into mild cognitive impairment, or it never becomes Alzheimer's disease. but the time to do something about it is early on, not when you're 65. It's when you're 40.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where I get into like points of frustration is where's the lever to pull to get people to care? And I think the lever to pull, the big one, the heartstring that I try to yank on as a coach and as a daughter, you said families, like impact to families for caring to somebody with Alzheimer's and dementia is huge. And normally by 35, you haven't had that experience yet. You don't know because your parents aren't there yet. Maybe you watched your own parent or a friend go through it, but it is emotionally exhausting. It is straining to everyone within the family infrastructure. And it is frustrating and debilitating and just heart-wrenching for the person who's in it, especially when they know.
Yes, and they do. And it's just a waste of life. Like my personal philosophy is that our brain span should equal our lifespan. Like we should be physically strong and mentally sharp as long as we're alive. Why settle for less? And the interesting thing about lifestyle choices, so you mentioned one of them, diet. It's also movement. It's mindfulness and sleep. Those are the four pillars. They all make a difference. It's a little bit like a 401k plan. It's never too late to start, but the earlier you invest, the better. And they can make such a dramatic difference. In fact, 80% of the chronic conditions that we deal with nowadays could be eliminated through lifestyle choices.
So let's talk, at least in this case, around aging. What
Yes.
are the lifestyle choices that are relevant for somewhat hope? I mean, we've only pulled one lever. We're going to talk about a bunch of other reasons to care, but like, what are the ones that are relevant?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is briefly link, we've been talking about Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, but associated risk factors for Alzheimer's are also risk factors that happen as we get older. It's obesity, it's diabetes, it's cardiovascular disease. And so when we look at things like diet, I mean, it's nutrition, movement, sleep, and mindfulness. And those all have an impact on the chronic conditions, but they also have an impact on brain health. And specifically with Alzheimer's, you and your listeners have probably heard about the buildup of this amyloid protein or these tau tangles. So from a pathophysiology perspective, nutrition can actually play a role in preventing the buildup of those proteins.
I'm going to backtrack for the listener because I don't know that they are necessarily as familiar with amyloid proteins and tau tangles as you and I are. But this is essentially that I don't, do we call it a theory? Have we accepted this as physiological fact yet?
It's pretty much physiology fact, the presence of this pathology. What's still unknown is the exact cause. I'll give you an example. Chronic inflammation is associated with Alzheimer's, and it's associated pretty much with every chronic disease, the ones I mentioned, diabetes, heart disease, vascular disease. But it's a chicken or egg. What causes what? Does chronic inflammation cause the disease? Does the disease cause the chronic inflammation?
I know total trainer brain being on the application side means that I don't have to live eyeball deep in the research necessarily, but amyloid proteins, tau tangles, those are accumulations of proteins in the brain that over the course of a lifetime do damage to the brain that then predisposes you for these down the road neurocognitive issues. And so I know the thing that's immediately coming to mind for me is that the research in sleep has shown that and if you listen to the sleep episode, my listener, I dive way into this, that as you go through the 90-minute sleep cycles, you fall asleep, you fall into deeper sleep, your brain shrinks. So cortical spinal fluid, there we go, there's a word, washes into the brain. Then the brain swells a little, it recedes, and this fluid bathes the brain and cleans out these protein accumulations. Now, if you're not getting sleep, if you're not getting good sleep, or you have enough inflammation that you can't get that normal collapsing and swelling cycle, then the proteins don't get cleaned out. Or if you are eating in such a way that you have more proteins than you can clean, there's an accumulation effect. So all of these little lifestyle habits and we're not talking like it happened once and now you're in trouble. We're talking about it happened over and over and over across thousands of days of a decade.
You're absolutely right. In fact, my next research paper, I really want to look at the link between lack of sleep in middle age and Alzheimer's, because there's a lot of evidence in this area. And it's scary to think that in our kind of our prime earning years and parenting years, when lack of sleep is the norm, not the exception, that we may be setting the stage for for dementia in later life. I want to give your listeners some statistics. Alzheimer's and other dementia is expected to reach affect 150 million people over the next 30 years. I mean, that's staggering. That's a staggering number. And we won't have enough people to care for them.
I think we're already seeing that. We're seeing that in caregiver burnout. We're seeing that through lockdown in this last year, the pressure put on families due to a lack of care. We're seeing that with people leaving the medical field. Not professional caregiving. And the thing that comes to mind for me is in the corporate workshops that I teach, when I do teach about sleep, very often I'm met with pushback from people where they're like, I got kids and a mortgage. I'm not going to go to bed earlier. Like, that's not an option. And they are literally choosing between earning enough and thriving long term, and that we've set up a society that's built on that dichotomy.
Yeah, right. It's the like 6.5 hours sleep is too short, and it's the norm. So it's kind of a funny thing. You and your listeners may have heard of the sleepless elite. When I talk about sleep, I always get someone in my audience, including my own husband, who says, well, I don't need that much. And I say, it's true. There's a genetic anomaly. It's called the DEC2 gene. If you have that gene, you may only need 6 hours sleep a night. But the chances of having that gene are like 1 in 20,000. You're more likely to be struck by lightning.
Yeah, isn't it? Is it 3%?
Well, I've read anywhere from like 3 to 5%, depending on which research you look at. And there's a husband-wife team out of UCSF now that are looking at additional genes associated with short sleep, and everybody thinks they have them. And for the most part, sleep is the closest thing to an anti-aging pill that we can get. But
well, and what I always
there's no side effects, but people don't want to do it.
The only side effects like lower blood pressure and a better mood.
Right.
Well, I always say that about movement around, like movement as an antidepressant, anti-anxiety, that regular exercise has been shown to be as effective as antidepressant drugs, and to increase as a supplement to antidepressant drugs, to increase their efficacy and their longevity of effect. And the only side effects of more movement are a better mood and better blood sugar. Like,
yeah, I agree. Can I tell you about it, since we're talking about aging and movement?
Yeah.
Can I tell you about an interesting twin study?
I love twin studies.
I love this one. So one of the things that I've researched quite a bit is the area of telomeres. And again, for your listeners who aren't familiar with it, telomeres are like these the end caps on our DNA, and they keep the DNA dividing and thriving. And at some point, they're a little bit like the protective caps on a pair of shoelaces. So at some point, if they wear out, the shoelaces are worthless, and that's kind of what happens to our DNA as well. So telomere length is very important, and it's one of the biomarkers that's studied when we look at aging. So a particular study that I'd read about, it was done in 2008 out of the UK, looked at 2,400 pairs of identical twins. And they compared twins that did recreational activity versus their counterpart who did not. Now, Darlene, this will be near and dear to your heart, because I'm not talking about exercise. It was just like walking to the store. It was playing badminton with a friend. It was recreational activity. When they analyzed telomere length some 6 years later, the equivalent in terms of age difference measured biologically based on those telomeres was 9 years. So the twin that moved was the equivalent of 9 years biologically younger. It's
Yeah.
it's so
And not and an important distinction. I know you nodded your head to the, like you gave me a little hat tap on this, but I want to spell it out for the listener. The reason that you said, I'm going to love this is because, I hate the word exercise, right? That this is not people who are hitting the gym for 2 a days and lifting and what they were just moving. They were just doing movement.
fun stuff.
Yeah. Just doing the fun stuff.
Arlene, I have a question for you.
Oh, geez.
I have a visual aid that I show, and it's a big chasm, and it's, a cliff on one side and a cliff on the other. And I label one knowing and one doing. And it's this idea that we know what to do. We know about nutrition, sleep, movement, mindfulness. And yet, why is it? How do we bridge this gap between knowing and doing?
Oh, well, can I push back on your question a little bit?
Sure, of course.
I think for those of us, and probably the average listener of my podcast is going to probably throw in on a similar type of belief as you and I. I'm gonna make that assumption for the average listener to my podcast is that they care about wellness and well-being. They care about self-improvement. Or I should say self-development. I try to avoid the phrase self-improvement because I think we're perfect as we are. We just want to be our best selves. But I think it's also easy for practitioners to assume, well, people are like us in the desire for those things. And underneath the desire for those things is also the belief that we have any effect on it, that we have a say. And the reason I bring that up is because at the top of the show, I was talking about people in my own family, right? People who are genetically similar to me who don't think we get a say, and they don't think there's actually all that much you can do about it. And unless the doctor is giving me a pill or the doctor says that I should do X, Y, and Z, and with great respect to our Western medical practitioners, and like they are not necessarily all that great at the lifestyle piece, which I, nod to you for being a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Like ACLM is trying to change that, but most primary care physicians do not have a whole lot of information on lifestyle, and they're not the experts, right? Which is, I think, really unfortunate. So I want to start my answer by pointing out that for the people that do know, like if we went out and took an average survey of like, okay, how to eat right. What's eating right? I think that we have a very confused population about what that actually means. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I have to admit that. I mean, people know fruits and vegetables. Okay. Like that's like playing poker. That's like jacks to open, But I think people do not there are a lot of misconceptions about what healthy eating is. And I have my own company, Zing, and the coaching I do, it's largely around educating people more around the science of nutrition, along with those other pillars, the movement, sleep, and stress. But I also find most people have no idea what they actually consume in a day, and they eat many things not because they're hungry. There's so many reasons to eat besides hunger.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And even fruits and vegetables, like my immediate thought was, keto kind of being the latest fad, like ketogenic diets with intermittent fasting. And it's, don't eat, but when you do eat, don't eat any carbs, but don't eat too much protein because too much protein actually gets converted into carbohydrate and so even something as simple as fruits and vegetables. Well, if we go intermittent fasting ketogenic, well, then you can't have sweet potatoes and strawberries and apples and bananas and a smoothie. And it just,
and I get a little apoplectic about those two diets, especially applied incorrectly. I think, and this has happened through the years. I did a funny blog on dieting through the ages. Did you know there was, in the 1920s, there was a cigarette diet, and it was a cigarette company that actually wanted to promote their brand, and they were trying to find a new spin. So they promoted it based on weight loss, and sales went up 200%. And gosh, back in the time of William the Conqueror, when was that? The 1800s. But he was the first to come up with the alcohol-only diet because he was too fat to fit on his horse. And so he simply went to bed, and all he would do is consume alcohol until he had lost enough weight to ride his horse. I mean, diets are nutty, low fat, low carb, all of that. For the most part, we need to make better choices about more nutritious food and avoid the diet concept completely.
Oh yeah. I mean, one of my big drums that I beat in kind of social media and on this show is that like when the subsection of the fitness industry that talks about dieting is just lying to you to sell stuff. Because we know in scientific literature, dieting as it has been billed to us does not work. Extreme calorie restriction damages the metabolism and causes a downstream, 107% on average gain, weight regain. So you end up heavier than you started. But okay, so if we put a pin to get back to your chasm question of like, do people actually know? Let's assume that they have the information and now we're seeing the behavior to application gap, right? I know what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not able to do it. The first thing I would go to is ambivalence. Are you actually ambivalent? Do you actually care? Right? I know what I'm supposed to do. I say I want the result, but I never do the behavior. Well, maybe do you actually want the result or do you just feel like you should? And so I would dive in with that person on what is it that they actually want?
Yeah. And how important is it? Because I've asked people a similar question. It's like, it just may not be the most important thing. You were talking about somebody who may need to work 2 jobs to put food on the table. Well, then that may be more of a priority than their sleep. But in the stack ranking, how important is it to you?
I feel like you're starting to interview me and you're supposed to be on my show. I'm teasing you. Well, but I do think the other wrinkle to expose, and especially for those of us who are fortunate enough to be coaches and work for ourselves, and not that we haven't worked super hard to get here, and I know you and I both have, but that there is like in our current late capitalist society, it is a privilege. It is a gift to be able to sleep restfully for 8 hours a night and not worry that you're going to have enough food tomorrow and be able to pay your bills and that your kids are clothed and fed and stable and you have power and there's not a big fire. And, like that's a gift. And I try to remember that as a practitioner, that when we're talking about lifestyle, like people have lives and things are going to come up. And that these are long-term trends that we're trying to work on, not drop in the bucket moments in time.
Yeah. And I think you hit on something really key. So I'll introduce just a little paradox here. Is that, with this knowing doing gap, is that I find a lot of your listeners, a lot of the people I work with, they're kind of such type A people. They may want to do everything right, and it's just too much. It's like, oh, I need to sleep, I need to exercise, I need to have my meditation practice, I need to do X and Y. And so I do believe it's a process of creating habits that support you over time. Do a lot of work around habit creation, but then sometimes we just need to be a little more gentle with ourselves and just say, hey, we're not going to eat perfectly all the time. We're going to have that birthday cake, or we're going to just be a slug some Saturday and lay on the couch. And that's okay. Let's look holistically at the choices we make and make better choices most of the time.
Well, I think when we keep the long-term goals in mind, right? The long-term goal is not to feel obsessed about whether or not I meditated for 18 minutes or 20. Mm-hmm. The long-term goal is to meditate so that I have mindful awareness of myself so that I can make better choices that result in a better, whatever somebody's purpose is. Yeah. Yeah. And it came up this morning with a client. They'd asked if I had read Don Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements, which I've actually done an episode on. If anybody hasn't, they want to go back and listen to the Four Agreements summary episode. Because it comes up and they were specifically talking about being impeccable with their word, that they were making habit commitments in our sessions and they weren't doing them and beating themselves up and they weren't going to do that anymore. And I was like, hold on, don't forget the fourth agreement. The fourth agreement is, do you know what it is?
I don't.
Do you know this book?
I know of it, and I have to admit I haven't read it, but now I
You should read
will.
it. You should read it. I think you'll appreciate the way that Don Miguel spins metaphor for a lot of the things that
Yeah,
we know the research underneath, but he is
yeah.
like painting a very accessible world for a non-technical audience. But the fourth agreement is do your best. I'm like, hold up, were you doing your best? You were in a pandemic, you just moved, you got a new job, you got a new baby. Like, did you do your best? Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, have the commitment, have the intention of I'm going to meditate and eat right and get my, 30 different vegetables a day or a week, not a day, a week. Um, and I'm going to go to sleep and I'm going to lower my stress and I'm going to climb Everest. Um, have all those intentions. And then I think you said it, be gentle with yourself. You did the best you could with what you had at the moment you were in.
Yeah.
And that's anything that any of us can do.
And I think it's just interesting. And I work a lot with a kind of like type A high achiever people. And I think people that are really interested in their health may skew that way. And I find that we can be so compassionate with others, but we're not always compassionate with ourselves. So
Oh yeah, 100
yeah,
times yes.
yeah,
Um, I'm aware that we have mostly talked about deficit-minded things, right? Like neurodegenerative disorders and people who desire to change positively and are struggling. But I think one of the more interesting and positive sides of your work is around longevity and vitality, and how do we put the zing to plug your company in your years. So, can you plug a bit about like why do you think it matters?
yeah. So I'm gonna answer that by telling you why I created my company Zing, and I did this after retiring twice. So I tell people that I'm in my third act professionally. I had a business. I sold it. I retired. I went back to work for 10 years in a different field. I retired and I said, I'm never going to work again. And then within 16 months, I started Zing. And I have a mission. Like my mission is to help people live their best life longer. Because what I became very aware of, and I'm an older adult, I'm 68, so I'm really in the demographic of people I'm working with, is that we have doubled longevity in the last 100 years. Since 1900, we lived twice as long, but we're not living better. And so we're at a point in history where longevity might be like this. And again, people who are listening, I'm using my hands to gesture, but picture a long line of longevity, but health span, the years in which we're physically strong and mentally sharp, is a lot shorter. And the years of disease span where we're alive, but we're not able to move or enjoy life, or we're in cognitive decline, it's way too long. So I wanted to change that equation. And I believe a lot in third acts. I believe a lot in reinventing. When I started this company, I went to Stanford. I got a certificate in nutrition science. And then I said, well, I don't think I'm done learning yet. So I am now a grad student at the University of Southern California. I will get my master's degree in gerontology when I'm 70 years old and proud of it. I'm the only grad student on Medicare. What about that?
That's pretty incredible. That's a claim to fame, I feel.
I know, I'm the only one.
Well, and I get whenever you this is not our first chance on camera together, and whenever you've shared that with me, I find it massively inspiring because I aspire to be a lifelong learner, and people around I've shared with you I got my master's degree last year, and people around me have been like, well, when are you getting your PhD? And I'm like, oh, well, maybe in my 60s. Like, I don't have time for it right now, but who's to say that that can't happen later, because it definitely can. And the more that you attend to your cognitive health and your vitality in your 30s and 40s, the more neural flexibility you're going to have to do cool stuff in your 80s and 90s.
Yep. Yep. And you bring up a good point, Darlene, because it's action. I talk a lot about action, lifestyle choices, what we do, but to piggyback on what you said, it is also mindset. And the view that we have of ourselves as we age is so important. There is Barbara Levy is one of the leading researchers around aging. And in 2009, she came up with this theory of stereotype embodiment. And what she showed was that children who had, let's say, grandparents or were around older adults and had a viewpoint of those older adults as doddering, feeble, irrelevant, those kind of conceptions you might have as you're a child. What happens is that as you grow into your own adulthood, that's what you assume being an older adult is, and you become that. So one of the challenges we have nowadays is ageism, which is rampant, but we also have challenges with our own kind of self-ageism and our own mindsets that limit what we can do and be as an older adult.
Oh, that's fascinating for so many reasons, right? Around, my head is spinning up around the way that we imprint ideas based on our cultures and families of origin, and how that affects, okay, I got to work 2 jobs to have the mortgage, to take care of the kids, to pay off the new truck, to I do those workshops with construction workers. That's why like I got my own stereotype in my head of the people who do my on-site workshops. But that's the model of the industry that they have been presented with. Like, okay, these are my 15 years that I can physically handle this. I have to get as far as I can before, my body starts to break down, as opposed to, why don't I keep this engine well calibrated and then it will run forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we grow into that. And I think it's hard to fight our own self-conceptions. I mean, I've found myself, doing things like, I can't find the car keys. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I must be having a senior moment. Well, to tell you the truth, Darlene, I'm always losing the car keys. I lost them probably when I was in high school and started to drive. And I didn't say, oh, I'm having a high school moment, but we attribute things to being older because other people do. And I think we need to stop ourselves in our tracks. And I think we also need to help children and teenagers understand that older adults are relevant. Like, you have a next act in you. There's a lot of acts.
Oh yeah, this makes me think a lot about the Japanese concept of Ikigai, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yes, Ikigai. You're not familiar. I get to teach Sally something. Okay, so there's not a direct word-to-word translation in English for Ikigai, but it is like purpose for being. It's kind of your closest phrase, and it's like, do you have a reason for existing in this plane of existence? And studies of older Japanese individuals have shown that those with Ikigai tend to have longer livable, vitality rich years, because you're waking up and you're like, okay, I have a thing that I'm here to do, so let me go do it. So there's a direct correlation between having reason for being, subjective well-being, and like purposeful existence and health and vitality.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it doesn't mean that your purpose has to be to change the world or solve world hunger or create world peace. It could be simply to be an active participant in your grandchild's life. It's something that inspires you, and it gets you up in the morning. And I'll tell you, that's what's happened with Zing. I'm so excited about the work that I'm doing. And, I was in the corporate world for 40 years and I did a great job. I was highly successful. I'm in love with what I'm doing now. I love it.
Which is, like I said, massively inspiring to me. I want to pivot a little bit because I want to talk about Ellen Langer's study. And I want to I partly threw this question in your prep because I want to hear your thoughts on applying Ellen Langer's study forward.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the counter
research. So Dr. Langer is one of the first psychologists ever to come up with this concept of mind-body connection. So she did her research in the 70s, and her big study for which she's known is called Counterclockwise. That was done in 79. And nowadays, Darlene, we say, oh yeah, mind-body connection, like, yeah, of course. But back then it was such a different concept. So the research was fascinating. She said kind of, what if we could turn back time from, instead of it's 1979, it's 1959. What if we could turn back time and people were actually living as though it were 1959? If they went back to kind of a younger version of their self, could that be measured in terms of some of the outward signs of physiological signs and biological signs of aging? So she had two groups, an experimental group and a control group. In the experimental group, it was men. They went to like a mansion in New Hampshire. It was like a retreat for a week, but they were immersed in 1959. So the limited amount of TV shows they might have seen then were from 59, the newspapers, the books. They lived as though it were 1959. The experimental group did something different. They did a retreat as well, but they talked more about 1959 as if it were in the past. So it was more of reminiscent. Now, both groups did really well. They were more engaged. They were more independent. These were men in their 70s and 80s. But there were some dramatic differences in terms of the two groups, one in particular on IQ tests. So they both did better than at baseline, but the control group did much better on the IQ tests. And then certain tests like dexterity and joint mobility, even finger length, which is interesting because of arthritis. And so there was something about turning back time and being immersed in a younger version of yourself that was effective. And it reminds me of a question that I've asked people: how old would you be if you didn't know what year you were born?
Oh, I
And
love that question.
most people say younger. I'd be 40. Like, yeah, if I didn't know, I'd be 40.
Oh yeah, I still think I'm in my 20s in the back of my head.
Yeah.
I say as I sit here in my undergrad hoodie, like anybody watching on YouTube, Sally and I were joking before the camera's on that she looks lovely and I look like I'm on my way to like the dining hall. um, but I want to highlight a few other things from the study because it always jumps out to me that they dressed as if it was 59. The music was all from 59. They got them to dance like it was like the popular dances from 59. So that it was truly this immersive regression to 59. But if I were, again, correct me if I'm wrong, like increased flexibility, some of them showed changes in like resting heart rate and blood pressure. Am I right about the blood pressure?
Yeah,
So
there
like
were
there were biomarker improvement in their
right,
health over a week.
right. A
And
week. And it's no pills. It was no pills. It was nothing, nothing radical except reimagining and this immersion experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
feeling younger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And what's key with it is that it's not only feeling younger, but you're doing it with a community of people who have similar beliefs. So that, to me, that this is, I'm going to just as a little bit of a side path. It's something that actually fascinates me when we look at the effect of exercise, for example. We like measure that effect, but we're not measuring the effect of like, oh, what if you're doing it with a group? What is that group impact, that being well together? What does that have to do with the equation? And I think that's what happened with these people, is that they were immersed in this version of their younger selves, but within a community.
oh yeah. Oh, you spun me. I was going in a direction and now we're over here.
I
Um,
guess,
well, and I think so often as Americans, right? We're both American, and most of the people listening to the show are in North America. So apologies to those who are global that I'm going to go down a tangent here, but we have such an individualistic society, and we're seeing the bill come due on that in a lot of ways with studies on loneliness, depression, anxiety. Other forms of mental health consequence for our commitment to like rigid self-identification, bordering on narcissism and egoism, and a lack of willingness to be open to group identity. Again, that bill is coming due in a lot of ways for us culturally. And if we bother to look at it, there are all of these ways that being part of a cohesive, bigger, transcendent whole boosts us up and gives us resilience and decreases our stress and lowers our anxiety because we know that we're not at it alone.
Okay, so to piggyback on that, and in light of where we started when we were talking about Alzheimer's and dementia, I'll tell you about some interesting work that's being done out of UCSF and Veterans Administration. And it's this concept of being well together. There's a research group, but then there's a nonprofit called Together Senior Health. And what they have found is that the combination of movement, mindfulness, and community is helping people with Alzheimer's re-engage with their loved ones. And it's like an online program where they go through kind of repetitive body movements where the brain is still able to function. But what they found was that it's not just the exercise, it's in a Zoom room, it's seeing other people, and it's doing it together with their caregivers. So very, very powerful way to combine movement and community to help people with dementia.
And also very simple, right? Like there's so many big interventions and medical study. Like that's the other thing, kind of tying back to what we were saying earlier about movement and depression. Like what's the cost of depression and anxiety on us as a society and also from a medical health perspective? And I don't have that statistic in front of me, but I bet it's way more expensive than going for a light jog 3 times a week for 20 minutes. And especially when you're doing it with your friends, right? Or if we're talking about elder care, it's like getting them to dance over a Zoom call with one instructor 3 times a week for 20 minutes with their caregiver.
The challenge around anxiety and depression, when you say, go for a light jog or go for a walk, that would be my prescription too. And I have never been clinically depressed. I don't know what that is like. What I do know people who have been, and I understand it's just not as simple for them to even be able to go for a walk. And this is, it's a whole different area, and I'm not like a psychologist. It's not an area that I've studied in depth, but it just, again, when we think about what people can do there has to be a certain willingness to try it and a certain mental health ability to be able to even attempt it, to consider it.
Yeah, I appreciate that call out. Having coached a number of people who are, have some kind of diagnosed mental health condition, including clinical depression and clinical anxiety. My approach obviously aligned with their practitioner team, right? Because I'm not running point on their mental health. I'm running point on their physical well-being and their lifestyle habits. Has always been the good day, bad day. It's like, okay, if you are having if you woke up in a brain that is telling you those messages, and that's the day you're in, what's the minimal, doable, tiny habit? Can you get out of bed? Then that's a win.
Yeah.
And on the days that you have energy and you have resilience, those are the days that you woke up in that brain. That's the day we go for the jog.
Yeah.
And what I've found working with those people over time is a snowball. We start to get this virtuous cycle going where because they're using the positive days with positive habits, we get more positive days. And again, like it's way more complicated than that. And I appreciate you giving me the call out there. But that's the coaching angle that I take with those clients.
Yeah.
But everyone is different and everyone's on the journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. If we button back to aging, because we went far afield, but we knew we'd do that. We knew we would do that. I want to leave us with this. And I appreciate your willingness to roll with this question, because when I wrote it, I was like, am I being rude? But one of the things I really love and admire about you is how well you openly embrace, like, okay, this is what the calendar says. And you don't care. And I never care either. I've never been one of those women who was like, how dare you imply on my actual age? And I love this question that you said earlier about like, well, how old would I be if I didn't know how old I am? And I challenge the listener to try to live at the age that they aspire toward. But our average listener, I said earlier, is about 35.
Yeah.
What advice would you give your 35-year-old self, if any?
Yeah, so this is a great question. If you asked me what advice I would have given my 20-year-old self, I would have said, stay out of the sun. And I think that advice is still good for 35. I would tell you, like, as I've gotten older, it's a regret I have. And I don't think I have any other regrets, but I wish I'd listened to my mother on that one. However, so when I think about myself at 35 or 40, I was a CEO of a company I'd founded at 28. I was working literally 80 to 100 hours a week. And I'm not kidding. I mean, I really was working that hard. And, you might think I would say, don't work so hard. But that's kind of silly. I kind of needed to do it at the time. I built an amazing business. I sold it. I have a certain lifestyle now because of it. But what I would have told myself is that you have a next act. And I think we can get caught up in 35 or 40 and thinking that what we are doing at that time is all that there is. And we'd better be the very best at it we can be because that's it. And it's not it. There's another act. And I'm so excited about this act. And it's also, I'm doing something that I never thought I would do. My background was in business process change and change management. And then when I retired and went back to work, I did leadership development for 10 years. And now I'm doing health span coaching, and I never thought I would do this. So don't limit yourself. That's my advice. And it's for myself, but it's your listeners. Don't limit yourself and think that it's just a one act play, because it's not. There's so many exciting possibilities ahead of you.
Oh man, I have so many thoughts because I think that we do really live differently if the belief is not, I'm going to retire at 65 and then I'm going to XYZ like that. And as a millennial, that is not the journey my generation is on. And anyone who falls into the age range that we're talking about here, they're, like maybe I hate the phrase Xennial, but late Gen X, early millennial, like through the millennials, we've been handed a very different pie.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we know we're going to be not, maybe some of us desiring to work, I desire to work well into my 70s and 80s, but also planning to, well, that's a very different cost equation on time spent than working 100 hours a week, right? Like, and good for you. I'm in my late 30s and I don't think I could make myself do that right now.
It was hard. I think the other thing that I believed, I no longer believe it now, and your listeners might believe, is that when you make this decision about kind of career path or whatever, you have to get it right. No, you don't. You have to make a decision, and I can't even say if it's the wrong decision, because there's really no right or wrong. There's just like, oh, I made a decision. Here's what happened, and here's how I make a different decision. But I know a lot of people are, they're when, oh my gosh, what am I going to do when I retire? Because what will I do with my time? You don't even have to know. You will figure it out. Something will come to you and will inspire you. And that can be true even if you're 40s and you're stuck in a job or a lifestyle that's not good for you and not healthy for you. There's other options.
Yeah. And when you just made a decision, you did the best you could with what you had at that moment, and circumstances change.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, Sally, that flew by. You are an absolute delight. Yes,
Great.
an absolute delight. And when you do some of these new studies that you have alluded to, you just let me know, because I will gladly have you back to talk about your work as it evolves. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's also really relevant. And hopefully we can inspire some people to take really good care of themselves so that they can have some life in their years.
Well, Darlene, thank you. And I love that this podcast is actually reaching a younger audience, because it's such a perfect time to start making some better choices. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And also no shade to my older audience members. I don't want you to think we don't love you too. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.